ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
High up in the Italian Alps, there are all these old trails and passes that have been used by shepherds and traders and travellers since the Middle Ages. Simon Tancred knew of these trails because he'd been guiding hiking tours through Italy for many years. Then one day someone approached Simon with the story of a group of Australian POWs from the Second World War, men who had fought in North Africa, had been taken prisoner, and sent to a POW camp in fascist Italy. Then when Italy switched sides, the men saw their chance to escape to freedom into neutral Switzerland, evading the enemy by using these ancient winding tracks. But this would be no pleasant sound of music type hike through the sparkling Alps. These men were desperate to avoid capture by the Germans. They spoke no Italian. They trudged through the snow and the cold, never knowing if the civilians they encountered would welcome them or turn them in. And there was also a personal, heartfelt aspect to this story for Simon. And so Simon bought some old maps and set out to follow the journey of that band of men who escaped to freedom by tracing their trek across the Alps. Simon Tancred's book is called Trails to Freedom. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Richard.
What a wonderful story. How were you introduced to the story of these Australian POWs?
Well, I heard from Kate Carrigan, a lady called Kate Carrigan, whose family are actually friends of my wife's family. She asked me for help organising a family holiday in Italy. There was about 12 of them. And they were going to plan the holiday around their father's peregrinations as a prisoner of war in 1943. So they asked for my assistance. And of course I helped them. But she told me about his escape. And I became very fascinated about the route of his escape.
When she showed you the photo of this band of men, what did you see? What did they look like?
They were typical Aussies. In fact, the photo that she showed me was taken when they had actually made it to safety in Switzerland. Yeah, they're pretty relaxed. I think it must have been taken in spring 1944, so they'd been in Switzerland for 3 or 4 months. They'd recovered from the trauma of their 3 years as prisoners of war. And they looked like pretty, normal, average Aussie blokes.
What are their names? Take me through who
There's
they were.
Carl Carrigan, his little brother Paul. There's Ron Fitzgerald and Lloyd Ledingham. And in that photo, there's 3 of them, but I presume Lloyd's the one taking the photo.
When Kate approached you with this story, did she have a good idea of the journey they'd taken up through the Alps?
Yeah, they had a pretty clear idea. She had actually put together a memoir with Carl, and also she got information from other members, his other friends, and it was about an 18-page sort of memoir. We were able to plot it fairly well. He also mentioned the escape route. Things got a little sort of blurrier with the escape route, of course, but there are enough points of reference to be able to figure that out as well.
Now, what was the family connection that you had to this story? What did you see in your own family story that connected with this?
Well, Carl's experience was really parallel to my uncle, my father's late brother. So he was 7 years older than Dad. And the parallels were kind of uncanny. Like Kate was telling me the story, and afterwards I thought about it. Carl was born in 1912. My Uncle John was born in 1913. They both were bushies. Like Carl grew up in Moree. My uncle grew up in Dalby, which is about 200 kilometres north. They both enlisted in June 1940 as regular foot soldiers. They both ended up in Palestine, as it was at the end of the year in 1940. Then they both ended up in April 1941 in North Africa, confronting General Rommel and his panzers. But Carl actually went to Tobruk, whereas Uncle John ended up in El Alamein. So their experiences were uncanny, but that's where the parallels diverge, though, because they were both taken prisoner. Carl was taken prisoner in April 1941, and then John was taken prisoner a month or 2 later. Carl made it to Italy in a prisoner of war ship, but unfortunately my Uncle John didn't. His ship was torpedoed, and the ship survived, but Uncle John was in the bit that was hit by the torpedo, so he died. My Uncle John had a bit of a mythical quality in my childhood. He was the Queensland bushy uncle. He rode bucking broncos. He had a rifle when he was 6. He was a bit of a larrikin. So I had a bit of an emotional connection with John.
Is that a bit of one of those sad episodes that people don't talk about in the family, or was it something that you talked about a lot, about the missing Uncle John?
No, it's just one of those episodes. I mean, Dad kind of adored his older brother, I think, but didn't talk about him a lot. But his photos in the house, and he was a bit of a presence. He was a nice-looking guy, a real regular Queensland bushie.
So what was the idea taking shape in your mind as Kate was telling you this story and you realised you had this kind of sideways connection to her father's story?
Well, I was happy to help them, and I was quite fascinated. I'm a student of history. It was a sort of episode I didn't know much about, so I was quite fascinated by their movement through Italy and the prison camps and things. But then the thing that really got me, of course, was the trails. That was the thing that really captured my imagination.
To me, it sounds like one of those days when the universe plonks something right in your lap, because on the one hand, you've got Kate who comes to you with this story, which connects with your own family story about their hike through the Alps. And what do you do for a living?
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah. I started doing my research, and it was a fascinating project. Like Carl's notes for the hike weren't that clear, but there were a couple of points of reference. So I used that as a starting point. And then, I speak Italian, so I got in touch with the Institute of the Resistance in Biella, dedicated to the history of the partisans. And I got in touch with a fabulous Professor Pagano, and we were able pretty confidently to put the actual route together. So once I'd done that, of course, I had to get the maps. So I ordered the maps from Florence, these beautiful old military ordnance maps. And, I put it together, and I got down and I drew the lines. And once I'd done that, of course, I had to walk it.
So these were 5 men who became 4 during the course of the Big Long Trek. There were 2 brothers, as you say, but had they all known each other before the war? Were they from the same part of Australia, these men?
The 5 of them were all from Moree, the Moree district. They all enlisted in June 1940. They all ended up in Palestine in training. They all ended up in North Africa. They were all taken prisoner. This is all together. So prisoners for 2.5 years in Italy. They were in 2 or 3 different camps, but they all managed to stay together, and then they all escaped. 4 of them made it, but the 5th, another Ron, the second Ron, he was captured, but he still survived the war. But I just think it's possibly unique that these 4 guys, a brother and 2 friends, had been through this whole experience together and came out the other end.
From the same country town.
From the same country
in New
town.
South Wales.
Yeah.
So they were taken prisoner somewhere near Tobruk in Libya, put on a ship and sent off to fascist Italy. Whereabouts in Italy were they put in a camp?
Well, they arrived in Naples, and then they were moved around a bit. They went to a place called Capua, which is south of Naples, and then a little place called Mona, which is east of Rome. They went to Bolzano, up near the Austrian border. And then finally, there was a purpose-built prison at a little town called Grupignano, and it was known as Campo 57, and it was quite close to the then Yugoslav border. And it was purpose-built, like they requisitioned all this farmland, nailed together these pretty shabby, temporary accommodation, and there were 5,000 Anzac prisoners of war held there.
See, I haven't heard this story before about this camp in northern Italy. What were the camp conditions like?
They were pretty primitive because, everyone, lots of people, there's the good Italian. Everyone loves the Italians, But in this case, it wasn't so pleasant. There was Colonel Calcaterra, was the commandant, and he was a right so-and-so.
Right, he was an enthusiastic fascist, was he?
He was, absolutely committed, card-carrying fascist. And they were very hard conditions. Like, for a start, just physically, because it's on this plain. So the winds from Eastern Europe across Yugoslavia would sweep through. They were very flimsy buildings. They had no doctors, very poor food. There was harsh conditions like summary executions, like just out with a gun and shoot someone there and then. And so it was pretty tough. And they were there for about 2.5 years.
And what was the labour they were doing?
I think they were doing nothing. There was just the boredom of being in prison. I think they did some labour, but Carl doesn't really mention it. It's not like they put in quarries or factories or anything. I think they just had the boredom of being prisoners of war. Carl was an exceptional character. He was sort of the leader of this group of guys. But he was, even in Bolzano, he was doing calisthenics. So he was keeping himself fit and ready for anything.
Ready to escape?
Ready to escape. I think just ready for whatever life was going to bring him. And then in April, the guys were moved across Italy to a little town called Vercelli in April 1943. And there were 500 of them. And I don't know whether they volunteered or they were picked, because they're all country guys. And they went to work in the rice fields, which people usually get a bit of a surprise. So there were rice paddies north of Italy.
Where are you going to get your risotto from?
Exactly. So they worked there, and it was a much easier regime. And again, it was Karl's call, I think, because he figured it'd probably be better conditions, they get better food, and there'd be slightly more opportunity to escape. Conditions, in fact, were a lot better, because in that part of Italy, they weren't fascist sympathisers. In fact, there was a lot of anti-fascism. They were put in these things called cascina, which were fortified farm houses. And the boss was called the Padrone. And one of them said that he laughed. He said, look, we were allies. He showed them photos of when they were allies in the First World War with him in a sort of British uniform. So they were quite sympathetic, and they treated them quite well. But they were still imprisoned, and they went and worked in the rice fields.
Meanwhile, while this is going on, the Allies, the Americans and the British, have invaded the south of Italy. They've come up through Sicily, they're coming up through the boot of Italy, they're going further and further north. And at this point, Italy switches sides. They see the writings on the wall and they switch sides and they say, all right, we're quitting the Axis, we're quitting a partnership with Germany, we're joining the Allies now. Adolf Hitler doesn't like this very much.
No, not impressed.
So he comes in and reinstalls Il Duce Mussolini as the head of a fascist government, but just pretty much over north and central Italy at the time. What did that mean for these men who were in this POW camp right up in the north of Italy, which was in this part of Italy that was contested?
Well, that change happened in July 1943, and then life was a lot better for them. So the Italian leadership signed the treaty with the Allies on the 3rd of September, and then they bolted. So the Italian leadership, the king, the generals, the prime minister, everyone retreated to the Allied south, left everyone else in Italy, including the army, without leadership. And then the announcement was made on the 8th of September. And as you said, the Nazis weren't very impressed. So there was already 200,000 German soldiers in Italy at the time. But part of the condition of the treaty was that they freed the prisoners of war. So they opened the gates of these prison camps around Vercelli, and some of them actually had wine and celebrations, like the guards and the Italians embraced. One of the Italians said, "You've been prisoners for 2 years, we've been prisoners for 20 years."
Under Mussolini.
Under Mussolini.
Right.
So, and they basically said, off you go.
So this is this kind of strange period when the Nazis have seized control of northern Italy.
And there's also the rump of the fascists, like particularly in the towns, like the fascist mayors and things. They had a vested interest. So they actually stayed with the Nazis. It was the beginning of an 18-month civil war. You had this sort of the fascist sympathisers, the establishment, and then you had a lot of deserters, you had a lot of young guys who were faced with being forced into the army, and a lot of, the historic resistance to the fascism anyway.
And communist partisans fighting as well.
Yeah.
So it was a very dangerous situation.
Really dangerous. And these guys, they didn't do anything for 2 weeks. So they were just milling around. And there was a lot of them. I mean, I said there was 500 guys in this area. They really didn't know how to move. There was danger for them. It was danger for the locals who were helping them.
So they made the decision to leave. What was their escape plan initially?
So their plan originally was to go up to a place above Biella called Oropa, which is a kind of a monastery, and they had been told that there were partisans up there, so their original plan was to join the partisans. There was a big group of about 100, and they're led by a couple of Italian partisans who were actually communist aligned. It was this convoy of about 100 people, and they were moving them away from the plains towards the mountains. And then the Germans turned up, and this convoy of 100 people scattered, and one of them was lost. Ron, in the scatter, the fifth member of their party, he was lost, and he actually got picked up by the Germans. So the troop was only now 4. And Karl and his friends found themselves at a loss in this little village called Vermogno. These guys ended up hiding in a barn on the edge of this little village.
What happened during the course of that night while they were in the barn?
So 4 of them were in the barn and they didn't know what to do. And this young woman came to the barn. She was probably the girlfriend of Sergio Santucci, who was one of the 2 guides. And she came and she rounded these guys up at night. She didn't speak any English, they didn't speak any Italian, but she made it clear that she was going to help them.
And where did she take them?
So she actually took them down across the fields and waited for a tram. And this little tram came through the night and it was blacked out because of, it was the war, so all the windows were blacked out. And these guys obviously were very nervous. They didn't know if they could trust this woman or not.
Didn't they stick out like sore thumbs?
Absolutely. And they were tall, rangy Aussies in prison wear.
And she's getting them to hop on this tram.
Hop on the tram. She just told them to be quiet. There are other people on the tram. They all kept quiet. The tram went through Biella, which by then had been occupied, locked down by the Nazis. And Karl actually mentions in his memoir, he peeped out the window and the place was full of Germans, which must have been absolutely terrifying. And then they did a loop around to the north side of Biella and the young woman signed for them to get off and they got off. She walked them to what turned out to be her home, a little apartment, took them into the apartment. Mother freaked out, of course. But they fed them, so they had the best feed they'd had in 3 years. They had wine, grappa, and they slept the night on the floor of that apartment. And then they set out the next day, and it was the beginning of their trek. So they went up the trail. They slept overnight. There was a little barn. There were some other young partisans there. So these are all young men. And they were pleased to see the Aussies, and they had a bit of a party, more wine. And then they all crashed out in the barn. And they woke up the next morning and everyone was gone, so just the 4 soldiers. The buttons on their greatcoats were gone. They'd been pilfered. And
someone came along and snipped off the buttons off their greatcoats?
Because they were, it was a time of great poverty.
Yeah.
And they figured, well, it's the least they could do for this young woman who'd taken such risks. So she slept the night there as well. And then they all disappeared and the guys made their way up to Oropa.
Did they have civilian clothes at this point?
I think the family gave them a change of clothes.
So they had civilian clothes, but if they're going to hike up into the Alps, what kind of conditions were they facing? Because we're talking about late September now, aren't we? And starting to get cold.
It was really harsh, and it was also an early winter. Unlike the Dolomites, which are very pretty mountains on the east of the Alps, the Western Alps are very harsh. It's kind of granite peaks. Monte Rosa, which was in that area, is 4,800 metres high. They've been carved by glaciers, so it's a very rugged territory. There's a lot of glaciers, still are. And it was coming into winter. So these guys, they had civilian clothes, but they didn't have any winter wear.
They were going to be following these ancient trails. What do you know about these trails, the history of these trails that have been there since at least the Middle Ages?
So those trails have been there probably for a lot longer. And
is it possible Hannibal and his army and his elephants used those trails?
Well, he definitely
did.
Not in this particular valley, but 2 or 3 valleys further south. I think Valley Susa, and those trails still exist. But the trails have been used from medieval times as trade routes, so like little donkey trains, and they were used as pilgrimage routes, and also droving routes. So in the summer, animals were taken up to the high pastures. But I think in those days they would have been pretty neglected and overgrown, but they were there.
And when you set out and walked these trails yourself, what do they like to walk along?
Well, they're much better condition these days because in the 70s and 80s, people discovered the beauties of hiking. And so much better condition, but basically the same. You walk along them and there's still stone medieval trails in sections. Some of them are just little tracks, but it's fabulous. You can actually see the stone paving, beautifully resistant, rarely maintained. They're just sort of kept clear, but they're sort of the original trails that people walked along.
How did it feel for you to be following this trail?
Well, it's very exciting because part of the attraction in Italy, the hiking that really got me in, was my love of history. And actually, I really enjoy walking on my own. I feel, you've got just sort of a free mind. And I love just this sensation and thinking that you're actually walking along trails that people have been using for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in fact, I was walking along the trails that these 4 escapees had been on. So I was experiencing the same big climbs, the same rocky scrambles. It's very exhilarating. It's very exciting.
So late September 1943, Karl and his mates arrived in the upper valleys of the Italian Alps. Tell me what happened when they staggered into the town of Riva Valdobia.
Well, they were shattered because they had just experienced, in Karl's memoirs, the previous 3 days are summarised in one sentence. He didn't want to dwell on it. And they had actually spent 3 days going across well above 2,000 metres. It's kind of a plateau, undulating plateau, way above the tree line. And they had done that on their own without food. They hadn't eaten for 3 days. They'd slept outdoors. They were debilitated anyway. They're 2.5 years in prison camps. And they were absolutely shattered when they arrived in Riva. But they were lucky because these little valleys were actually anti-fascist strongholds. And so they were in friendly country. There was still a danger, but fascist patrols didn't get up into this end of the valley. It was too dangerous for them.
And so were they welcomed into this town?
Absolutely. Apparently, in Carl's memoir, he said school kids came out and cheered them, and they set up tables in the square, and they gave them, as Carl said, macaroni, lots of delicious macaroni, and wine. Carl said it was pretty crook, but they drank it just out of politeness.
It was the homebrewed stuff.
Homebrewed, yeah.
So that gave them the energy to walk the last few kilometres of that day to the town of Alanya then?
That's right. And on the way, they were so relaxed, but they heard a vehicle coming. Whereas the previous time, they kept off the roads, they hid. They felt completely relaxed, and it was a truck full of road workers, and they actually gave them a lift and drove them up to Alanya. And then the drivers took them to a cafe, which still exists, Cafe delle Guide. They shouted them drinks, they fed them, and they had a big sort of celebration in the bar. The other local people joined them.
And so in that friendly, gregarious environment, could the locals give them information on how to find their way up through the Alps from further on from there?
Yeah, fortunately, because previously, I don't know how Carl actually found his way from Biella to Alanya, because they had no maps. It's this block of really severe mountains, glaciers. I'm just assuming that he basically just thought, well, head north and we'll find our way. But
just pick the gap between the mountains, perhaps?
I think so, because, like I said, 3 days without seeing people, somehow they managed to navigate their way. But here, the options are much more limited. At the head of the valley, and there was a very well-worn medieval trail. So there was only one way across, and it was pretty straightforward.
So tell me about the man who was actually able to help them and help them lead them out of Alanya.
Well, he said, come along, boys, I'll help you. He had one of those little summer huts, little sort of shepherd's hut above the town. And he said, look, it's on the way. Why don't you come and we'll stay there and then you can start your hike from there. So he took them. And Carl, as I said, was very strong and fit and he could keep up with this guy. But the other three were really suffering. They were really debilitated and quite weak. So Carl and this other guy had to wait and wait. But they eventually made it up there. They got into his little hut and they bedded down for the night for the big climb the following day.
What did you see when you followed that leg of the route, Simon?
Well, a couple of landmarks Carl mentioned. They went past a waterfall and, I passed a waterfall.
Well, that must be really cool when that happens, actually.
It's really nice, yeah, it is, because really you have this sense. And like I said, walking on your own is great because your imagination's free. And then there was a steep climb and there's an Alp, an Alp is actually not a mountain peak. An Alp is actually the flat grassy plains, the high plain pastures.
It is?
Yes, yeah.
What? Really? I thought the Alp was the mountain.
No. An Alp is actually, these high pastures.
The non-mountain part of the mountain.
The flat bit, yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to go rethink everything in my life now after I know that. I didn't know that.
So this is Alpe Pecce,
right?
So that I came up to, and absolutely beautiful. And I was there in September, so it was very lush sort of after the summer growth. And it's at the foot of Monte Rosa itself. So the mountain with two glaciers is actually right in front of you. So you can see the second highest peak in Europe and these glaciers coming down, and then there's the Alp. The people up there are actually of German origin. In the head of these little valleys around Monte Rosa, they were refugees, religious refugees from Germany who settled there in the 13th century. There's a beautiful collection of houses.
And this was a place called the Refugio
Pastore.
Pastoral refuge?
Yeah, Pastore is the shepherd. So the shepherd's refugio. But the actual name is Alpe Pecce. So that's its correct name.
And did these men, the band of POWs, did they stay in this place in 1943?
They did. So it was a collection of little houses, ancient stone houses that have been restored and converted into this refugio, which is a place where you can go and overnight. Quite a comfortable refugio. Some are pretty primitive. It was the only houses on this Alp, so I'm pretty safely assuming that they slept in one of the little houses.
So the next day, Simon, you had to confront the Alpine Pass the men went through in 1943, the Passo del Turlo. Why was that such a daunting prospect for you?
Well, it was the conditions when I was there, because I have done this hike 8 times now.
You've done it 8 times?
8 times. So I know it very well. I love it. It's very hard, but now I feel quite relaxed about it. But back the first time I did it, it was quite confronting, and there was a very serious climb. I was there in August, but the weather had turned.
And when you're climbing this path, are you climbing like a dirt track, or are you climbing stone steps, or what are you doing? How are you going up the side of
Well,
this?
I didn't know what to expect. And I had, there was snow up the top, like it had snowed the day before, and I was anticipating snow when I went up. So I was frankly, quite worried. And I was anticipating, like a little donkey trail. But in fact, it was a beautifully made old stone road. It turned out, I learnt, that road was built in the 1920s because the Passo del Turlo actually looks across the valley to the Swiss border. And Mussolini, in his sort of paranoia, was worried that the Germans might actually attack Italy going through neutral Switzerland. So he had these stone roads built up at these strategic passes so the Italian army could get cannons up there to hold off the Germans.
Right.
And this path, this road, which is an amazing bit of engineering, took 6 years to build.
But you're nonetheless fighting off feelings of gratitude for Mussolini at this point?
Absolutely, because it's a proper cambered road. And it's ironic because the Germans didn't attack, and the only people who actually used this road were Mussolini's enemies. So it was the partisans, the Allied prisoners of war, and the Jewish families, because the POWs were being joined by Jews, because once the Nazis took control, then the persecution of the Jews started getting very serious. So there are also Jewish escapees in this period.
Climbing up through the Alps.
Yeah.
What do you know about the soldiers' journey up through that pass?
Well, it got off to a rough start because they were down in this little hut, and their friend's wife arrived in the morning, and she was furious because you can imagine what she saw were these 5, drunken men, hungover men, and the soldiers wouldn't have been a pretty sight.
Right, this is the wife of the guy who led them up to his shepherd's hut?
That's right.
Where they slept the night in this little...
She was furious.
Right. She was furious, right.
Well, you can imagine, because Carl and his friends hadn't had a shower for a long time, and they'd been on the road for 3 weeks, so they were all hungover. She was furious, and she ordered them out.
She kicked them out?
She did. And the guy didn't even have a chance to, point them in the right direction. But there was only, as I said, there was only one trail. Despite all that, they must have been in really poor shape. And they only got a little way up the path, and there was some stone huts, some more shepherd's huts. They actually broke into one, and they had a bit of rice that they'd been given in Riva Valdobia. And so they thought they'd overnight there, build up their strength, cook some rice, and they lit the pot, set fire to the chimney, and managed to put it out. But they had a good night's sleep, which was a good thing. And then they set off the next day.
What did these houses look like when you went past them?
Oh, they were in beautiful condition. I think they'd been restored. And there were still farmers up there. Like when we do the hike, we often have to make way for like a farmer with the donkeys and his dogs and, going down to get provisions. So they're still taking their flocks up to these and grazing them up in the pastures.
You write that each of the houses had this little block of white quartz, like the size of a house brick, standing on the apex of the roof ridge. What was that about?
Well, I did ask that because they like each of the houses have them. And I was told initially that they were anti-lightning, to ground the lightning.
Yes.
But it didn't convince me.
No.
And it turned out that there's this wonderful tale that they're actually to ward off these cranky spirits, so of evil elderly ladies who could wreak havoc on the shepherds if they didn't behave themselves. So they could abort cattle, they could turn their milk sour if they wished. So they were these sort of, malign spirits. So if you put a block of quartz on top of your house, it warned off these evil spirits.
So meanwhile, the men in 1943 are climbing higher and higher up into the Turlo Pass, just as you were climbing higher and higher all those years later up into the Turlo Pass. Now, this is above the tree line, isn't it?
It's way above, yeah. The tree line's about 1,800 metres. So the Turlo Pass is about 2,700.
And what does it look like once you get up there above the tree line?
Very barren, very harsh. I mean, really, it's basically granite. And really, the ridges are decaying. So they've been mashed up by glaciers, some of which are still there, but they're just basically decaying. So all this rock has tumbled down. It's a jumble of...
So it's like boulders, glaciers and gravel and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Sounds like the interior of Iceland. You know, it doesn't sound very hospitable at all.
No, not really very pretty. I mean, and there's no greenery. There's maybe a little bit of lichen. And the amazing thing was... when I got up to the pass, I looked, and there was a couple of ibex.
What's an ibex?
Well, in Italian, it's stambecco, and it's basically a mountain goat. And these creatures are quite large, like they're about 100 kilos. They've got these huge sweeping horns, and they live above the tree line. And they somehow manage to graze and live off lichen and moss.
What are they like? Are they nimble on these rocks and boulders? These ibex?
Absolutely. They dance across them. They're amazing. And then these great big beasts. They're very impressive. And there's usually a pair of them. So I don't know. Carl wouldn't have seen them because they were hunted nearly to extinction. They've only recently come back in the Alps. So Carl wouldn't have seen them. But I thought it was a very good omen when I was climbing up there. But these are about the only animals that live up there. It's quite a barren... There were flows of snow, there was a low mist, so it was fabulous, but a bit daunting.
And once you got up there, what was the view of the land around you like?
The pass is quite clear, and it's been properly engineered when they built the road. And it's a little slot in the ridge, and it's paved. There's a memorial to the soldier who built the road, and there's a little Madonna, of course, because being Italy, that would have been there when Carl crossed. The Madonna would have been there. And it's the most wonderful view. From the other side, you look right down the Karatza Valley, it's called, which is a big kind of empty glacial valley. There's a little emerald lake at the very end, and then a big wall of mountains and these jagged ridges, and that's Switzerland. And for me, and I think for Carl as well, like that's the climax of the trip. You've 4 hours of hiking, you come through this little slot, and there it is, sort of right down in front of you.
So you can see the green of the valley below?
You can, yeah. And there's actually, because you get back down below the tree line, so there's pine forest down in the valley, and then this little emerald lake at the end.
So tell me about the next guide these men found in the hamlet of Karatza.
So they followed the road. And the road actually on the other side is much, I suppose it must be the exposure or something, but it's much worse shape. It's actually a lot harder. You think once you've got to the top, you've done the hard work. But there was still 17 kilometres going down and through the valley to get to the end of this leg. And so the guys sort of would have gone down there, easy to follow. There's a river. They would have followed the river, and they got to the end of the valley. And there was a little village. There were 8 houses. It was like a little hamlet called Karatza, the same name as the valley. And the village doesn't exist anymore because they created the dam. It's a hydro dam in the 1950s, and they flooded the village. They were met by a group of people, and this was the staging point of their final leg. So Switzerland was across the valley and up the slopes on the ridge, and that was the one-day hike. So that was the final climb. And so they were greeted, and they were taken into a barn. They were, a little boy met them who's 16, young boy, and he said he could be their guide. And they did a deal, and he said, I'll be your guide if you give me watches and your greatcoats. And I think they figured by the time they got to Switzerland, they wouldn't be needing that, so they agreed. And the boy, they gave him a feed of potatoes and some grappa, and they bedded them down in the barn.
Carl, you say, later considered that 16-year-old boy their saviour. Why was that?
Well, I think because the boy said when he was talking to them that his brother had been killed by the Germans short time before that, doing exactly leading other soldiers to their safety. So it was extremely dangerous. And this young boy, actually the following day, did manage to lead them, and he didn't go all the way up, but he took them to safety. And Carl was a religious man. He believed that this little boy saved them. He was their guardian angel.
Oh, he was heaven sent.
Yeah.
Do we know what became of this 16-year-old?
I wrote this book during COVID, so, I had time on my hands. And wonderful thing with the internet, you can find all sorts of things. And I was actually researching the hamlet of Karatza, and I was trying to get a photo to get a visual idea of this village. And it turns up the local paper, La Stampa, did an article, one of those days gone by articles, and they interviewed this old guy about living in Karatza. And his name was Angelo Iini, and this is written in 2013. And he said, he told them about life, and he said, it was paradise. And they used to do a lot of smuggling, because being on the border, it was a sort of smuggling town. But he said when the escapees started arriving in September, and the Jews, he said the whole town changed, and the smugglers became guides for these people. And Carl said that he had entered the first house that he arrived at in the village. And Angelo said that his house was the last house in the village, at the far end of the village. So I just figured that must be the same house. And Angelo was 16 at that time.
Angelo was the guide?
So I'm pretty sure that Angelo was the guide. I was quite excited. I thought, that must be him. Yeah, and it turned out, like, just recently, Angelo has actually been recognised. I didn't know this when I was doing the climbs, but recently the town's rediscovered a bit of this history, partly because of our presence, and Angelo's been recognised as one of these guys who saved a lot of people. And unfortunately, Angelo died in 2016, so I didn't get a chance to speak with him.
But you found him, though?
I think so, yeah, I'm pretty confident, yeah.
So the last and longest climb remained. After they crossed the river, they faced the steepest climb to the Turlo Pass. What was that climb like for those exhausted, bedraggled men at that point?
Well, it was dangerous for a start because the Germans had occupied the towns. So they had to get across the river and through the town, the back of the town. And then there were German patrols too. So the Nazis were there, so there was that first danger. And then, you can imagine these guys after 2.5, 3 years in prisoner of war camps, and then this enormous hike that had taken 8 days, they would have been absolutely shattered. But of course, they could see the end, so that would have kept them going, I'm sure.
You mentioned that the 16-year-old Angelo, who we hope is Angelo, led them up there, and then he had to part ways with them at some point?
Yeah, so Angelo collected them, like 2 o'clock in the morning, gave them coffee with a shot of grappa, of course. They managed to get across the river because the guards had been moved off the rivers. They thought they'd have to wade across this icy river. And then they started climbing up through pine trees on not on the main trail, but on one of the droving trails, so that get up to the pastures. It was a long, hard climb. And Carl was able to keep up with the guide, but the other guys are really falling behind, like they were really at the end of their tethers. So it would have been about 1,800 metres. They reached the edge of the tree line, and the boy hung back and he said, "Switzerland's up there." And he said, "I can't go any further because for sure they're observing these trails, and if I go out, they'll pick me up and confront me when I go back." So
So it was too dangerous for the guide, but equally just as dangerous for those men then?
Well, I think it would have been dangerous for the guy going back into the town, but I think the guys are pretty much in the clear. I don't think they're actually Germans on the mountain slopes. They would have been observing from down in the town.
And what do you know about that last leg when they finally arrive at the Swiss border, right up there in the high mountain pass?
Again, once you get up above the tree line, it becomes this just rubble, glacial rubble, and it's quite a hard hike even for us. And it was still another 2 hours. So the Passo del Turlo is 2,900 metres. So it was a 1,000-metre climb, quite steep. We went up a pretty good trail, but these guys, were taking the secondary one. And then you get right up to the top, and there's this big slab of granite. These days, they've actually put a golden Madonna on the top, but at the top of that slab, on the edge, it falls away at the back, and that's actually the Swiss border. So that's the demarcation. So they would have had to have negotiated that slab, and then there's a little trail that goes around the back. And the only comment was that Carl turned around and he commented on how beautiful it was, looking back over Italy and Monte Rosa.
He allowed himself that.
And then they went round the corner and they were in Switzerland.
What kind of border control was there? Because, every man, woman, dog and cat is trying to get into Switzerland at this point. What border control was waiting for them when they got to the border?
At that stage, there was only, there were about 500 Anzac soldiers managed to get across. There's, I think, 380 Aussies and about 100 Kiwis managed to cross that pass and the one next to it. But it was only in a period from September to March, because the Germans, like as I mentioned, they were locking down in September, but by the arrival of March, they'd locked the whole thing down, so that it was no longer an escape route. And once winter hit, it was pretty hard anyway, because the conditions were so severe. So these guys got over just, in the nick of time, really. Yeah, and they went over the pass, and they were confronted by 4 German-speaking soldiers with guns. And Karl thought, oh no, but it turned out they were Swiss guards, and they greeted them, and they took them down. There was so down in the valley, which you can't see again because they created another hydro dam in the 1950s, the Swiss, and they flooded this. But there used to be a little hotel, and that had been turned into the reception area. So the guards walked them down. They gave them food, cigarettes, change of clothes, and they were safe.
The only thing about that, though, is once you arrive in Switzerland, it's completely surrounded on all sides by the Axis powers.
Exactly,
so it's kind of, and it's landlocked as well, of course. So while you're safe and you're free in neutral Switzerland, you can't get out, can you, until the war's over? Is that pretty much the case for these guys?
That's exactly right. And also Switzerland, like we kind of imagine Switzerland as this little mountain sort of paradise, but Switzerland was exactly, they were surrounded, Vichy French, the Nazis, the fascists, and Switzerland was doing it pretty tough. And Mussolini had intended to invade Switzerland at the end of 1943. He still had a Operation Tannenbaum that was going. So Switzerland was under the pump as well.
Oh, yeah, he found Ethiopia pretty hard going. I don't know how he would have done getting his men over the Alps, but
no, I think in the Swiss, I wouldn't be taking on the Swiss, that's for sure. I have a Swiss brother-in-law, and I wouldn't, you don't monkey with the Swiss. But
so what did they do in this time then, in this period before they could get out of Switzerland?
Well, they were still they were registered, but it was very light control. They had to account for where they were, but they were able to work. They were able to travel around. Some of them learned how to ski. Karl got a job as a farrier, so he was, with his country background.
Like making horseshoes, you mean?
Yeah, and shoeing horses. And so he made some money, and, not Karl, but some of them had Swiss girlfriends and, ended up with Swiss wives. So, but they were, ultimately pretty bored and pretty restless. They either wanted to get back into action or go home. It's that whole, the boredom of just waiting.
Waiting again. So mid-1944, there's D-Day. The Allies are coming in through France, from the west. The Russians are approaching from the east, across the Russian front. 44, I would imagine, would be the earliest they could have gotten out of Switzerland. Yeah,
so after D-Day, and then, the fall of France and Marseille, that was important. They captured Marseille about the same time. So the seas opened up again. So they started moving them out, I think, in September 1944, and I think Karl might have gone in October. They trained them down to Marseille, and then he got on a ship, and I think they went via Naples, and at some stage, maybe it was in India, they went through the Suez Canal, and they got onto an American Liberty ship. And he said conditions were pretty primitive, but, the Yanks were great, They treated them very well in their movies and good food. And they got back to Australia before Christmas 1944.
Back in the days when the Americans were friendly to their foreign allies. Right. Isn't that a nice time?
That's right. No, the Yanks, he said, were great, as we like to remember them. Yeah.
What became of Karl Carrigan in his post-war life?
He had a pretty good life. So they actually, when they arrived in Melbourne, there was a reception organised by General Blaney. And then they were all repatriated. So Karl went back, and his brother and the guys all went back to Moree, and that was the end of his service. And Karl married. He bought a little property on the New South Wales border. He had 10 children. And then he moved to Armidale so that his kids could have a good education. And that's where my wife met the Carrigan family and became friends. And Karl, he had a number of grandchildren, and he died at 77, which is a little young, but he had a great life, a very fulfilled life.
And what did this odyssey mean for you, having replicated this big, long walk over the Alps?
Well, it was very moving, I have to say. It was unexpectedly. And
how would it catch you like that?
Well, I think, when I got up to the top of the pass, because my father he fought in the Second World War as well, but he was in New Guinea. I've never been of a military bent, but, it really brought home to you, what these guys did and what they, really, without being corny, but the sacrifices they made really set up, this peaceful world that we've been able to grow up in and thrive in. So it really, made me much more aware of the gratitude and the sacrifices these people made for themselves, their families, and the future of their people, their community.
And your Uncle John, who didn't make it to Italy, who'd been on that ship that sank in the Mediterranean, did thoughts of him come into your mind at various times?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, all the way, along the way, because, as I said, there was just this absolute parallel with him and Carl. And there was Carl, with this wonderful, rich life, 10 children, tons of grandchildren. Poor old John just died this anonymous figure. I mean, his name's on a pillar in El Alamein, and it's also in the War Memorial. And I sort of thought, I'm the only person, I'm sure, all his relatives are gone, who ever spared him a thought. And I thought, well, it was a little unfair for such a nice guy and, someone who'd made sacrifices, like millions of others, I suppose. There's young people who, just lives were cut off.
And people like your dad and Carl Carrigan, as you say, picked up their lives, got on with their lives in peacetime afterwards. When I hear stories like that, I always think of there's this really powerful moment in that US PBS series on the US Civil War. And after the war, the soldiers' memoirs have been read from. One of the soldiers in his memoirs said, he finished his memoir and he said, did I really do all those things? Was that me? Was that me who did all those things, who saw all those things? I'm sure it was like that for Carl Carrigan in reflecting on the war, and perhaps for your dad as well.
I think so. And typically, they didn't really talk about it, of course. But for Carl, Kate had to extract, she wrote this memoir really from stories that Carl had told, and she asked him questions, and she put it together from his friends. But he really didn't go into details, didn't want to talk about it. But Anzac Day, of course. Every Anzac Day was very important. And the survivors all got together and, probably relived it a bit. But I know my father, never talked about it. A few funny little anecdotes, but not something they wanted to dwell on. And it, you think, they got home safe and sound, but it didn't end there for a lot of them, I think.
Nonetheless, what a wonderful story. And I'm really grateful to you for bringing it to me here today, Simon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your interest. No, it's a wonderful story, and I hope I've done it justice.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Simon Tancred's book is called Trails to Freedom. Today's conversation was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer was Mickey Morris. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Hello there, I'm Mark Fennell, and you may know me as the guy who finds the stuff that the British stole. Still doing that, but I'm also embarking now on a new hunt. This is a hunt for the people, the objects, the actions, the stuff-ups, the moments that essentially changed the course of history, but at the time, no one saw them coming. Each week, we will unravel stories from across the globe, from bizarre crimes you might never have heard of.
He's using the early 20th century equivalent of a high-vis vest and a lanyard to get into the Louvre undetected.
To brushes with death that changed science.
He sort of becomes like a boogeyman or a demon. Something you read, it sort of sends a chill down your spine.
You'll meet the people whose presence continues to be felt from the grave.
He imagined a secret society which would be watching the schools, the universities, to establish a worldwide English-speaking global elite.
There is no chapter of history that is off limits, and each and every one of these inflection points has somehow reshaped your life and my life.
I don't think this is talked about enough. The outcome of World War II was not a foregone conclusion.
We think that restitution is a contemporary debate. It's really not. It's been going on forever.
No one saw it coming. Brand new episodes every Tuesday. You can listen on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. Had Freud been alive at the time, he would have had a field day with all of this.